This episode brought to you by Cafe Imports, Minneapolis-based importers of fine specialty green coffees. Independently owned and operated since 1993, Cafe Imports has been dedicated to decreasing its impact on the earth through renewable energy, carbon neutrality, and by supporting conservational efforts in places where quality coffee is grown and also where quality coffee is consumed. Where does your coffee come from?
And by the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation. As a nonprofit, we rely on support from listeners like you. If you like what you hear, please consider a donation. To learn more and make a gift, visit us at www.gosuperior.org.
Welcome to the Lake Superior Podcast. I'm Walt Lindala.
And I'm Frida Waara. We are made stronger by story, and there's no better source than the continent's largest body of fresh water, Lake Superior.
So join us as we highlight the 5 national parks that ring this greatest of the Great Lakes, meet the people, tour the places, and learn about the projects that make these parks and body of water so remarkable.
This podcast made possible with the support of the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation and Media Brew Communications.
I'm Walt Lindala.
And I'm Frida Waara.
Welcome once again to the Lake Superior Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about something interesting in terms of the big lake and, well, some of its inhabitants. And we're talking with someone we had on before, Shawn Sitar, here a little while ago. Tell us about this, little Frida.
He's just so fascinating. Anytime you get a chance to listen to Shawn talk about, as a fisheries biologist, the quality of our big blue out there, you really know you're going to be sitting with the expert. And he has such a great way of making it all so that we can understand it. Because, you know, when it comes to science, I sat through the class and I sat in the front, but I don't think I always caught up with everything I needed.
I'm in broadcasting and announcing because my forte was words, not necessarily so much science, but that's what makes this fun. Let's welcome here to the Lake Superior Podcast once again, Shawn Sitar, Michigan DNR Fisheries Research Biologist. Hello, and welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're talking a little bit about not only, you know, the whole thing. We're talking about some lake trout and some numbers and updates with that. But you've studied the Great Lakes all over the place. And sort of a first question for you from us is, why do you call Lake Superior your hometown?
Well, I've had the pleasure, as you mentioned, to work on all of the Great Lakes. And I've gotten seasick on all of the Great Lakes, including Lake Superior. So I grew up out east and went to school for biology, and I actually, to be honest, I knew nothing about the Midwest, which has its own culture, but also I really didn't know a lot about the Great Lakes other than what you learn in geography class. But yeah, when I came to Michigan, I went to school at Michigan State and started working on the Great Lakes, and I've worked on Lake Erie, Lake Huron, Lake Michigan, and then finally Lake Superior. So I've been able to experience all of the Great Lakes, and like most of your listeners, I would say Lake Superior is probably the best lake. It's the most pristine and natural, and I've spent most of my career on it. And I've grown up in many places in the world, and I've never really identified with a hometown. But I guess in the last 10 years of my career of working on the lake and spending so much time on it, I really felt a connection. And I realized, I look at Lake Superior as my hometown.
I love that. I just love that. And you know, Shawn, we love to say it's the biggest, the baddest. And now when we're talking lake trout, it's also the best.
Yes. So it is the largest lake, I guess, on the earth in terms of surface area. So that statistics there. Lake Superior is also the deepest among the Great Lakes. But lake trout are an important species. So if you talk about fish or people that fish, lake trout is the top dog in the Great Lakes and deep water areas. Based on my research and the work I've done, I would say Lake Superior has the most abundant populations of wild lake trout. And it's because of how pristine and natural Lake Superior has been. It's the least disturbed among the Great Lakes.
But can you describe for us in history why lake trout have been affected in Lake Superior?
Well, the lake trout is a big story. And in fact, there is a documentary that just came out called The Fish Thief that I would recommend your listeners to watch because it really tells the story more comprehensively. The lake trout is the top dog in the Great Lakes deep water systems. It's like the wolf. It's the boss of each Great Lake. If you look at it, it's the apex predator. So the apex predator in ecosystems serve a role kind of like the boss of a factory, a really fine-tuned factory. So if you look at ecosystems, each of the Great Lakes are like a factory. And so they run, and there's different sections of the factory that run efficiently to produce things. So that's in ecology, we call that productivity. So if you look at it as a comparison with a factory, you want everything to work efficiently, but there is a top boss that regulates the factory or manages the factory. In the Great Lakes, that boss was taken out in the mid-1950s due to a couple factors. The first factor was in the mid-1900s, they were under intense commercial fishing, and humans had this concept early on that a lot of resources were not able to be depleted. There's like this manifest destiny type thing where, we could never overutilize our natural resources. So there was a lot of pressure on lake trout in the mid-1900s. And so the populations were under severe pressure. And then when invasive species invaded the upper Great Lakes, it basically toppled it over. And the major invasive for lake trout was the sea lamprey, which is a parasite native to the Atlantic Ocean that attaches to lake trout and actually sucks on their blood. So they're kind of like a vampire.
Shawn, can you explain real quick for those of the listeners that maybe are with us here today that don't understand, like you mentioned, it is an ocean, it is a sea-based invasive species. How did it get to the lake? How did it become a problem?
So a really huge event occurred. So Niagara Falls is a natural barrier to the ocean. So a lot of marine species come up the St. Lawrence and Lake Ontario and are stopped by Niagara Falls. I'm pretty sure there is no animal that can really scale Niagara Falls besides humans. So they bypassed that with the Welland Canal in the early 1900s, like 1920s or 30s. And basically that was a big door that opened up to the upper Great Lakes. And that was, the intent was to allow shipping to occur into the Great Lakes, but I don't think people realize that the invasives also came along as hitchhikers or just came through that door.
That makes sense. I see that. So then what happens? I mean, you have these two major factors that you're talking about being commercially depleted, being out, basically fished out, and you have the invasive species. What then happens to make the turnaround to restore lake trout in Lake Superior?
So those two major factors caused basically a Great Lakes-wide collapse. In fact, lake trout were extinct in all of the Great Lakes except Lake Superior. So it was the most distant from the invasives. It was also the coldest, so it had less impact from invasives. So this happened by the late 1940s and early 1950s. Basically, they were extinct, essentially. So then all of the natural resource agencies, including the Michigan DNR, were trying to figure out a way to recover and deal with this. And it was an international effort with Canada. So in the mid-1950s, the Great Lakes Fishery Commission was created. It's a binational guiding body that helps coordinate management and research to manage the Great Lakes. And its first job was to deal with sea lampreys and recover lake trout. And that was the start of the lake trout story in terms of the recovery effort. So lake trout recovery has been ongoing since the mid-1950s in the Great Lakes.
Let's just keep adding to the recovery because if it started in the 1950s, but we really only got our report card just recently?
Yes. So Frida speaking to recently a success story was finally just declared and ultimately announced for lake trout, and that Lake Superior lake trout are formally recovered, or in science they like to call it rehabilitated. So it is a huge success story in fisheries management, which is pretty rare. And we're also seeing signs of that recovery occurring in Lake Huron and Lake Michigan. And so since the 1950s, one thing I want to point out, there's a three-pronged approach to recover lake trout. The first thing was to suppress sea lampreys, which continues to this day. And that's conducted by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in support from the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. The second component was to control fishing, the two major factors that caused the collapse. The third thing that came about was a tool that was to use hatcheries. So they raised lake trout and stocked them. So those three components were used for many years and still are used to this day to maintain and continue to recover populations. But Lake Superior lake trout is a rare success story, and they're essentially fully recovered.
We're talking with Shawn Sitar here today on our Lake Superior podcast about the return of the lake trout, not only in Lake Superior, but across the Great Lakes. And he's a Michigan DNR Fisheries Research Biologist. What would have it meant, Shawn, if the lake trout would have all gone extinct? I mean, what is the benefit of having it back as opposed to having it gone away?
So if we look at a story, so by the 1960s, if we look at Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, Lake Erie, and Lake Ontario, the absence of lake trout, the top boss in the system, created a lot of havoc. And during that time period in the 60s, late 50s and 60s and 70s, there was another invasive called the alewife, which is a small oily fish from the Atlantic Ocean that came up. And it just basically boomed in the Great Lakes. It's like a noxious weed, an invasive weed you don't want. It boomed, and I guess there were so many of them, and they have unstable dynamics in their populations that they would have massive die-offs on the beaches. And I've heard accounts and seen pictures where they actually had to bulldoze piles of these on the beaches, and it was really, I guess, smelly too. And so some of you may not be aware, but as a tool to manage the alewives, the DNR, there was a biologist in the 60s, Howard Tanner, and a bunch of other scientists thought of the idea of bringing salmon, basically like a lawnmower, to come in and basically feed on alewives as a control mechanism. So that basically established salmon in the Great Lakes. And originally it was a management tool to basically mow down the alewife populations and keep them in check. But it also provided, as a side benefit, a huge booming recreational fishery that created a huge industry in all of the Great Lakes.
Well, Shawn, if the boss is back in the factory, but there's also the salmon component here, how is that going to balance?
That's a really good question. And then typical in complicated situations with humans, it creates it can reach to a management conflict. So restoring native species is really important for the health of the system. It's like having your factory working right. But salmon weren't originally here, and so then you have another top boss. And then in recent years, lake trout recovery was coinciding with those major efforts to control lampreys and stock fish, but also alewives were also found to be a major obstacle to lake trout recovery, in that when lake trout eat alewives, it has this enzyme in their bodies called thiominase, which breaks down B vitamins in lake trout. So that was also contributing to the lack of wild spawning in lake trout. So alewives basically started crashing in the mid-2000s or late 2000s in Lake Huron. And when those alewife populations crashed, lake trout started recovering, because essentially they were like a toxin or a poison to lake trout for recovery. But salmon like alewives a lot. They're not as affected, and salmon are stocked. There are some naturally produced salmon, but a lot of the salmon were stocked. So it is a management dilemma. But with alewives leaving, the salmon are starting to reduce, lower in their abundance. And in particular, Lake Michigan, this creates kind of a conflict in natural resource management, and that there's a lot of people that want the salmon, but the alewives are leaving. As alewives are leaving, we're starting to see natural recovery of lake trout in Lake Michigan. And so it's kind of a user conflict, and basically, eventually alewives are going to bottom out, and salmon aren't going to be as abundant. And so I think people have to accept what the ecosystems can produce as they become restored or more natural.
You mentioned that this was an international effort that was getting these back and doing away with the sea lamprey and everything. How does a cooperation like that get established? How does it keep going? And how do you kind of work together to make sure something like this doesn't start to happen again?
So it is an international effort, and the Great Lakes Fishery Commission was formed internationally between Canada and U.S., and it's actually one of the most functional guiding bodies I've seen. So I look at it as sort of a really well-working United Nations that's guiding many of the agencies. So there's federal agencies, there's state agency, all the different states, but also includes a lot of the tribal agencies, as well as many university researchers. I work closely with many researchers to try to answer questions and come up with solutions. And it's really worked well, and it continues to this day. And when you go to a Great Lakes Fishery Commission meeting, it's really where you can basically find out a lot of information on what's going on the Great Lakes. It's like the information hub, or like the Reddit.
When we talk about that cooperation, obviously, the water doesn't have a boundary to it. What's the financing like on something like this? Or what are you projecting financing could turn into with changes in administrations?
I guess I think it is a major priority. The amount of money spent to recover lake trout, it was mandated as a huge directive and a priority for both nations. So I think for the most part, at least, like sea lamprey suppression and the other management activities and research will still be funded, even though there's things going on because of how much of a priority it is. And I think people have learned their lesson of how, with that falling apart, how catastrophic it was to the Great Lakes. So I have faith that it's going to continue. There may be some, minor things that are going to change in the near future, but I think, that effort will be sustained, because I think all of the agencies, both in the U.S. and Canada, are aware of how important this is.
So what are you doing in terms of monitoring? Do you have sort of ongoing monitoring, especially in the spring and summer months? I mean, what do you look at, and what are you doing to stay on top of all of this?
Okay. So, a good way to look at, so my job, all of the agencies have different roles. Sea lamprey control program has roles. So it's almost like these Great Lakes are like these factories, or if you think of them as engines, and all of our researchers and agencies are like gauges looking at the status of populations. So my job is to basically go out and census the populations at different times of the year to monitor their status. And we have benchmarks established biologically, so we know that they're healthy and we know the numbers. One thing we always look at is the impact of sea lampreys. So when we go out and sample lake trout, we're always checking them for sea lamprey wounds. And that gives us an index of the effectiveness of sea lamprey control, and we feed back those wounding rates we see on lake trout to the sea lamprey control program, so they can direct their efforts to continue to suppress lamprey populations.
What can we do to ensure this won't happen again?
So I think I put some thought to this. I think it's really important to be aware and informed. So I think understanding this lake trout story. So if you read this story or watch that documentary, you'll get an idea of how big of a deal it is and the amount of work it takes to restore something that was just naturally there. So I think being aware and informed are probably the most important things, and spreading out the word and educating.
Shawn, we're moving to just another little piece of the puzzle. Lake trout were affected so much by, yes, the commercial fishing pressure, but also then on the invasive species. But do you have any thoughts on how climate change is also going to impact the lake?
It's already happening. During my career working on Lake Superior and the Great Lakes, I've already seen surface temperatures increase, from when I started till now. There's a lot of variation around it, and I think there's already research ongoing to assess these impacts. Like if we talk about lake trout, they're really a deep water, cold water species. So a direct temperature effect on them probably isn't likely as much as an indirect effect. So they rely on that ecosystem and different components of it. And I think those other things are going to be impacted, and it'll be an indirect effect. So I think it's already in action, and a lot of research and monitoring is going on to kind of keep a tab on that.
It seems like this is one of those that it's just kind of like at least there's an awareness now of why this is important to maintain the lake trout population, what it means, and also that there is an understanding that it needs to be kept going that way. Climate change always, is one of those topics that people kind of say, well, it could be this, it could be that, we may see it. You seem like you're adopting kind of, I wouldn't say a wait and see attitude, but kind of let's see how it plays out. Would that be correct?
I think some of those impacts are hard to assess because the change is a long-term thing. It could be 50, 5, 10, 15, 50 years before you see like a result. So while we're caught in the middle of that timeline, we're just monitoring, and then we have some ideas on what we can predict can happen. So yeah, you're right. It's kind of a wait and see, but we're also collecting information and doing different scenarios, different outcomes. And we'll just keep modifying that as we get more informed.
Does that mean that research has gotten even more complicated for you, though? Like there's so much more yet to study?
I think science and research is always that way. I just think the type of questions change over time. And, as I've mentioned to you when we discussed this before, I'm like the third generation of scientists that worked on lake trout recovery. I came in at the end of the second generation, and my boss, mentored me, and he was part of that second generation. I'm on that third. And the type of questions I have to answer are a little bit different than the first generation scientists when there was no lake trout. So yeah, there's always changes. I'm not sure about the complexity. I think what really helps deal with the complexity is that we have so much technology today, and we have so much information at our hand instantly. In fact, on a phone that we never, like those first generation scientists were doing stuff on like these things like punch cards or something, and the computers were the size of houses. And now, I could do everything on a tablet. So I think we're able to tackle more complex things now, with technology and all that information stored, and we have access to it now. So, yeah, I guess I'm not sure if it's more complicated. I just think the questions are different.
Shawn Sitar is on the line with us here for the Lake Superior podcast today. Michigan DNR Fisheries Regional Biologist. How can people find out more about the work you do? And remind us again, what was that documentary film you mentioned about this with lake trout, but how can they find out more information?
So I urge those to have a good success story, with actually a happy ending in Lake Superior. I would recommend looking at the documentary called The Fish Thief. And I think if you go online and do a internet search, you can find that. And as well, that same process can get you to any information you want to learn about the Great Lakes. The Michigan DNR website is really informative, as well as the Great Lakes Fishery Commission website. But as you start doing that search, you'll start getting into that rabbit hole. There'll be a lot of other information out there. And that's what's nice about today is you can have a lot of information, even on your, on your phone anywhere. So yeah, I recommend just doing searches. And I think, watching a few films and documentaries and informational articles or documentaries will help you lead to other questions you want to answer and then be informed.
Shawn, when are you expecting that you'll be back on a boat?
As soon as ice is out, hopefully mid to late April. It depends on how ice is, as those know how it is to live up here. And so, yeah, we'll be back on the lake or my hometown.
Yeah,
I love that.
Well, that's
good. For the folks that have not been around the shoreline in mid-April, when Shawn will be back out there gathering research material, say a prayer, because it can get pretty nasty out there.
Yeah. So again, people want to find out a little bit more, Shawn, you can get a hold of you through or found out more through various websites. Search the DNR, Fisheries Research Biologist, Lake Trout and Lake Superior. It's been a wealth of information that you've shared with us here today because, I mean, I've known lake trout and salmon, and I enjoy salmon, and I enjoy lake trout, perhaps for a meal or something. But all this connection and everything, and growing up on basically the shores of Portage Lake and the Portage, and then also Lake Superior, knowing about sea lamprey. But the timeline has been real interesting with you today, Shawn, sharing that information with us.
Yeah, it's important to think about things globally because a lot of people know about animals in the Serengeti and what's going on in Africa or the Amazon. But also, it's good to be informed what happens locally. So he said, it's always good to be informed globally, but you can act locally.
Well, we've learned something here that we've done it locally with you and hopefully apply it globally to everybody. Shawn, certainly appreciate your time with us today. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Shawn Sitar, who is a Michigan Department of Natural Resources Fisheries Research Biologist, and Frida, it's true what I said to him in the comments there before we cut him loose is that I didn't really know all of this. I mean, I learned a little something today on this podcast about lake trout, their role in Lake Superior and the Great Lakes, the salmon, how they're here. I knew about sea lampreys and everything, but I always kind of thought those came in on some of those vessels and they were just in the ballast tanks and all that stuff we hear, but they just kind of found their way too. So it's been a real interesting episode today to learn a few things.
Well, and trust that if he's going out there in mid-April, they are getting the research as soon as they can. And as the tools change, they have so much technology, they're really going to be able to put that information together and we'll have a better picture of what the future will be.
Well, we thank Shawn for his time today. We also thank your time for joining us here on the podcast. We appreciate you listening in with us. Again, if you have an idea or something you'd like to hear us talk about here on the Lake Superior podcast, you can find us through the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation. Let us know what you think. That's pretty much going to do it for us this time around. Think about this the next time you're maybe sitting down to a lake trout dinner or some salmon from the Big Blue, because it sounds pretty good right now. That's going to do it for us. I'm Walt Lindala.
I'm Frida Waara. Thanks for listening. The National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation, NPLSF, is the only official nonprofit 501c3 fundraising partner of the National Park Service for all 5 U.S. national park sites on Lake Superior.
To learn more about NPLSF projects and programs, you can visit the website at nplsf.org or friend them on Facebook.
I'm Frida Waara.
And I'm Walt Lindala. Thanks for listening to the Lake Superior podcast.
This podcast made possible with the support of the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation and Media Brew Communications.
This episode brought to you by Cafe Imports, Minneapolis-based importers of fine specialty green coffees. Independently owned and operated since 1993, Cafe Imports has been dedicated to decreasing its impact on the earth through renewable energy, carbon neutrality, and by supporting conservational efforts in places where quality coffee is grown and also where quality coffee is consumed. Where does your coffee come from?
And by the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation. As a nonprofit, we rely on support from listeners like you. If you like what you hear, please consider a donation. To learn more and make a gift, visit us at www.gosuperior.org.